One of the most well-known periods of the Second World War is the Blitz. That's, of course, Germany's relentless campaign of bombing against the United Kingdom. Steve McQueen, one of the most acclaimed directors of his generation, just made a movie set during that time. Today, how Blitz fits in the canon of war movies. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, I'm going to be upfront with you. I love Steve McQueen's work. He's one of those directors who I genuinely kind of wait for to see what he's working on next. He's got a new movie about the Second World War, and it's a movie about one of the most told stories of World War II. It's about the Blitz. It's set in 1940, and Germans are starting their bombing campaign against the United Kingdom. The Blitz ended up killing more than 40,000 civilians over an 8-month period. This is a movie that is told through the eyes of a 9-year-old boy named George. He leaves the safety of a train evacuating London to find his mother, played by Saoirse Ronan, who works in a munitions factory. Here's a little bit of the trailer.
My mum sent me away.
She did it to keep you safe.
Your son did not arrive at his destination.
You're responsible for his safety. Why can't you tell me? Where's my boy? This is for all the parents whose children have been evacuated, and for my boy, George.
I have a group of film critics here with me to talk about Blitz. Hanna Flint is here. Rad Simonpillai is here. Jackson Weaver is here. Hanna, Rad, Jackson. Welcome to the show, friends.
Thanks for having us.
Hello. Listen, Rad, I'm going to start with you on this one because you recently spoke to Steve McQueen. He's the director of Blitz. What did he tell you? What did he tell you about what inspired him to make this movie?
I interviewed him for a story that's coming out in the Globe and Mail later this month. But what he talked about, in terms of like the origin story for this, he kind of gave a 3-part answer. And that was so the first off is just growing up in London in the 80s and seeing kind of the scars of war in the architecture where that's where a building would have been bombed out. But also growing up with what they call the stiff upper lip British attitude, where that seems to like this tough and calcified vibe that seems to have been born from the trauma of war. That's one part of it. The second part of it is that, look, in 2003, Steve McQueen was the official war artist for Iraq, appointed by the Imperial War Museum. And so he was with the troops in Iraq, and what he experienced there was this camaraderie among communities from Britain that might be at each other's throats otherwise, like different races, different neighborhoods, different accents, that kind of stuff. And he was just taken by this camaraderie where they set aside their differences while they're at war and they find this unity. And that's very much a part of what Blitz is, right? People setting aside their differences and putting on this unified front for survival. And then the third aspect of it is when he was doing research for Small Axe. Small Axe, if you're not aware, is this 5-part anthology series where he recognizes the resilience and contributions that Black immigrants in London have had in the 80s. And in a way, Blitz kind of fits as almost an extension of Small Axe in that it's highlighting kind of the contributions of these marginalized people in this historic period. So while researching for Small Axe, he came across this photo of a young boy on a train platform, a young Black boy on a train platform in an oversized coat. So all of these ideas that were sitting with him for decades kind of found their anchor in this photo where he wanted to imagine what the experience was through this little boy.
I think to sort of fixate on that little boy and the idea of the little boy being the origin point of this movie, this is a story that is told from the perspective of George. That little boy became George. He's a 9-year-old Black boy from London. He's played by first-time actor here, Elliot Heffernan. Hanna, as you watch this movie, how did it feel to watch the Blitz through George's eyes, you think?
Yeah, I think it just ups the stakes and the ante because, war's terrible, but if you're a child, it's so much bigger. And, it's really interesting when you kind of see the world through his eyes, see the kind of level of it, it's the kind of looking up the people he meets on the way. I kind of love this idea of, I don't know, it's like a classic kind of trope, isn't it? Separation and reunion, and a kind of journey that he goes on the way, meeting all these different characters. It's almost like fairy tale, like kind of Wizard of Oz sort of story. He just wants to get home. And so I think having him, and at the opening of the film, it talks about the amount of children that had to be shipped out and the effect that it had on. And certainly kind of what was, it's hard not to watch this film and not think about what's going on today. And that little boy, Elliot, he is so gorgeous and lovely. And of course, you know, him being mixed race as well adds a whole other dynamic. That's not just, you know, he's not just facing war, he's facing racism.
Yeah, of course. Jackson, I want to talk to you a little bit about the way that we see race and class play through this movie, because through George's eyes, you get this experience of race and class playing out in wartime, playing out over the Blitz. What do you think of like how this movie handled the tensions over race and over class?
I think that's the most interesting aspect of this movie and the best argument for why it exists, because like as you mentioned and Rad's talked about a bit, the Blitz is one of the biggest points of the war from the British perspective that we see in film. It's like
it's been represented before.
You've heard of the Blitz spirit is something we know. The stiff upper lip, the we come together, we survive. There's a little bit of, not on the overall, but a little bit of negating of that in an interesting way in this film. We see George, we see the black soldier that he is befriended by, Ife, and they do experience subjugation. Saoirse's character is also a little bit marginalized. There are some chips in the armor and the depiction of, oh, we all just came together, we got together and we survived this, and the propaganda of this is we're you know, this unified front. There are cracks in that here, which I find interesting and a new way of depicting this, because also, you know, specifically the Black experience during World War II is one of the least documented and explored aspects of that. I mean, there's the whole African theater that we, of course, see in history, or like if you go to the actual systematic murder of Black people, the Rhineland bastards in Germany, these are things that happen that so often are not really depicted, or if they are, they're like, oh, look, we have this air regiment and we're so proud of them. That's what interested me here. I'm not sure if it went all the way, because there are times when it does just kind of go back to the hooray, we came together. But I will say that injecting that kind of thread into it is very interesting.
So like, that's what I like about McQueen's work. That's to me, like, that's sort of like the thing that sort of ties his work together, Rad. I think that there's something about McQueen that sort of takes stories that we think we know and adds like a subversive element to them. I don't think you come away saying the entire story is different. I think he sort of injects a single sort of moment of humanity into the work that makes a larger narrative no longer as coherent, if you will, which is to say it's good and better for us to have like a complexity when it comes to like approaching something like the Blitz. Do you think that's a little bit of what he was trying to do here, to try to say like, you think of the Blitz as like this sort of singular notion, but actually we should complicate that a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, I think for one thing, like I think he's very intentionally telling a very conventional story, one that fits with those classics that you would have seen in the past, one that fits in kind of the familiar World War II stories. And there's so much like, you know, I think Hannah used the word even kind of a trope in terms of his Odyssey. There's something almost Dickensian about this. These are all familiar things. But then, you know, that's not that's the stuff that, you know, like he anchors a story to. But it's always interesting watching the scaffolding of his films, and the scaffolding being like the cracks, that chips that Jackson was referring to. But also, I mean, for me, when I watch his movies, I'm so fixated by the environments he builds and the details in the environments. Like you go back to 12 Years a Slave. You think about 12 Years a Slave, it's anchored to the story, the Solomon story, but think about the attention he pays to in terms of the economics of the environment, in terms of how humans are capital in relation to the lumber, in terms of how, like, in relation to their masters, and the idea of like the mortgages that people have to take out. Like he really builds out this entire environment and economic system and the people's relationships and how capital moves across geographic spaces. He does that in Widows too, you know, a heist thriller. And so he does that here as well, where he's building the architecture, this environment that London is, especially during wartime, where you're seeing the war machine, you're seeing that Saoirse's working in the munitions factory, you see them organizing in the shelters, you're seeing geography laid out by class and all that stuff, and then as this boy's working through it, you're paying attention to those little details, those chips and those cracks and stuff. So that's why it works for me.
Hannah, I'm glad that Rad brought up the scaffolding idea, because I think of McQueen as sort of like almost like a novelistic filmmaker. Like, you know, plot is one thing, but it is really about this sort of like immersion in a world, and that's what I go to McQueen for, like this idea of sort of being like fully immersed in a well-built world. And with that in mind, listen, you're a Londoner, you're watching this movie. Do you watch this movie and kind of come away with a different idea of London as you watch it?
What I liked about it is that it's actually exactly my idea of London, of the multiculturalism. And I think that is one of the biggest things that has been missing from the myriad World War II films, Blitz films. You know, there are barely, set in East London, that's probably one of the most multicultural areas. You know, East Asian people working in laundries, you know, it's the shipping docks around the area. So there were so many people, there's Jewish people, you know, Black people, and I really appreciate there's a scene in it. So several scenes where there are these these shelters, and they talk about that, which feels far more like real and authentic than, you know, that scene of Winston Churchill on a train in the darkest hour. And it's like, he was not that guy. But this film, it feels like, oh, it's finally representing and stops putting this idea that British history is white solely. So I really enjoyed that. What I think I really felt, I learned about was, I think speaks to your point, Jackson, again, about the way that the government hung its population out to dry, especially people of the lower classes. The fact that they weren't allowing them into the shelters, down into the tube stations to shelters. I didn't know that, and I found that quite shocking. You know, and the scene where, say, Saoirse, the character, she's singing on the BBC, and a difference between the kind of like the factory work and saying, just open up. And it's just these moments of like, yes, this is what happens. Systemic powers during war. Again, the propaganda machine of this. Yes. Sometimes the people, the people you vote in are not looking after your interests. And so I think that was really good. And it really, you know, pulled back the kind of veil, the rose-tinted glasses of the Blitz spirits, actually. And I really appreciate that.
If I can just remind folks, my name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. And today is Remembrance Day, and we have film critics Jackson Weaver and Rad Simonpillai and Hanna Flint, and we're talking about Steve McQueen's new movie, Blitz. Look, Jackson, there are countless movies about the Second World War. You know, Alyssa Wilkinson of the New York Times wrote that might be because of like the timing, like the idea that like, the war sort of breaks out at the same time like cinema is kind of coming into its own as its own kind of art form. When you think about the Second World War, why do you think filmmakers are still drawn to World War II as sort of an arena to sort of investigate?
I mean, I think this is, in terms of memorable history that people are still around that have experienced something, this is the most impactful and wide-reaching event of recent human history. If you are in Montevideo or if you're in the Arctic, there are stories about World War II reaching those poles. And it's something that has such an insight into the depths of the human heroic spirit and also depravity. There's just some sort of, you know, a way to get insight into what we can survive and what we can do to one another. There's also just the filmic tradition, as you mentioned, evolved very close to the outbreak of World War II. I woke up this morning. I spent my morning watching Lights Out in Europe by Herbert Klein, an American filmmaker. And then also Fires Were Started, the British film about firefighters during the Blitz. And these were films that were either made by, you know, members of the public who wanted to incite action, make people either become involved with the war, or by the British government itself, which had the Central Office of Information or the Crown Film Unit, whose purpose was to make propaganda film and shape public opinion. Winston Churchill actually said the movie Mrs. Miniver did more for the British war effort than a flottillion of battleships, because it got America to think that entering the war was inevitable. And I'm reading this other book, The Story of British Propaganda. I just want to read a little bit of it because it really explains how important it was at the time. The author writes that historians have argued that Britain was democratized and modernized by the experience of the war, and also that Britain was bankrupted and ultimately broken by it. One of the reasons it can be so difficult to thoughtfully weigh these radically competing sentiments is because the ubiquity of the propaganda film. Winning the war entailed creating a series of extremely powerful myths about Britain's role in the world that continue to reverberate around the Anglosphere today. So the war was the inciting incident that created this tradition of the propaganda film. And it was so impactful, and it spread the idea of how culture should work in such a meaningful way that we can't escape it. We keep making movies about it. We keep exploring it. again and again and again.
Yeah, I mean, I think I take seriously the point that war is not just war. War is also an opportunity for story making and myth making and nation making and like a narrative creation in so many ways. And sometimes those narratives stick around for 100 years after that war because that's the story you kind of keep telling over and over about yourself as a nation. I guess with that in mind, Hannah, the idea that war becomes like this specifically the Second World War becomes like this opportunity to set in contrast what is happening in modern day and what was happening then, and sort of say, like, do you see the similarities and do you see the differences? How do you think, how does it feel watching this movie, Blitz, right now when so many devastating conflicts are going on right now?
Well, it's kind of like last year's like Zone of Interest. That was the movie that's about then, but it's about right now. And I think maybe Blitz is this one, because even from the opening, I was in tears from the beginning. I found it really difficult to watch this fiery inferno. And it's one of those things where, watching that in a context of a fictional space, it's devastating, but it's like you literally just go on Twitter or X or go on Instagram and you can see these things happening in real life. You see the videos of it. So I think it's quite difficult to watch these type of films. And I can only hope that by doing these films and having, this little boy, we've seen people, girls and kids being killed, and like there is a distance between them. And I think the best thing that cinema can do is humanize the people, humanize the figures, humanize the lives that you don't know, that you don't meet, but saying that was a person. They had a whole world around them. And I think that's what I think the best thing we can do about these films. If we're going to look at the past, it always has to be about what's going on now, because unfortunately war is continuing. So yeah.
I agree that is like, to me, like sounds like the same kind of work that Zone of Interest was doing. I should just also remind people Zone of Interest was a Jonathan Glazer movie that was set during the time of the Holocaust. It is a Holocaust movie that is not a sufficient description to tell you about the journey you would go through if you watch that movie. Rad, we should say the reviews for Blitz have been more mixed than you normally get on a Steve McQueen movie. Some critics really enjoyed it. Others said that it's his worst movie. Where do you sit on this?
Look, like, I know that I've enjoyed certain Steve McQueen movies more, like, say, Lovers Rock and stuff. And to the critics who don't love this movie, it's like I see their point. I think I can understand why they feel that way because of some of the conventional plotting, because it's a movie that in its effort to, kind of map out the entire war, it's piling on a lot of stuff onto this child in terms of his experiences. And you might feel like that's kind of tropey. But at the same time, I mean, going back to the scaffolding, like, I appreciated that. Yeah. Going back to what Hannah's point about, capturing that civilian experience. Like, he did not make a war movie about frontline soldiers. He made a movie about civilians, right? And, like, when you think about, like, the relationship filmmakers today have to Hollywood history and how Hollywood has mythologized the war and Hollywood has created heroes out of the war and Hollywood has turned America into a hero out of those wars. His conversation with that is, well, here's that alternative perspective, as everyone is saying, and he's giving you the civilian perspective that absolutely resonates now. When I mentioned this, exactly what Hannah was saying to Steve McQueen, it's like his head could not rock any harder about, like, this relevance to today, right? But also, like, in terms of like, just the Steve McQueen artistry of it all, there's a scene with a fire hose that looks like a serpent that goes like out of control, and the effort of people bringing it, like, there's all of those kind of touches where he's putting in his signature and he's in conversation with previous filmmakers and he's elbowing out space for his artistry and for the characters he wants to represent. But that's what ultimately carried this movie over for me.
It is a movie that I'm 100% going to see. Like, there's no way around this. I'll tell you, one of the many things that excites me with this movie is Saoirse Ronan. Saoirse Ronan, very heavily favored to definitely get an Oscar nomination out of this movie. If she does, it will be her 5th movie. What's wild is that it won't even be her first Blitz movie, because she was in a Blitz moment in Atonement, and that got her an Oscar nomination. And so I take seriously that this is a movie that is trying to do things that other war movies have not attempted to do. So I got to leave it there, though, guys. But Rad and Jackson and Hannah, thank you for your time and thank you for being here. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Oh my God, anytime. It's been a delight. Rad Simonpillai is a freelance film critic whose work shows up at the Globe and Mail, CTV, and right here on Commotion. Jackson Weaver is a reporter at CBC's Entertainment Unit. Hanna Flint is a film critic who co-hosts the podcast Fade to Black. By the way, you can watch Blitz in theaters right now or on Apple TV Plus on November 22nd. And by the way, tomorrow you can hear the director Steve McQueen on Q with Tom Power. That is it for the show for this Remembrance Day. Remember, you can listen to the show anytime you like, wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube. We're on Instagram at Commotion CBC. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. My friend Rad Simonpillai, who you just heard, will be in for me tomorrow. But I will see you on Wednesday.